Hi, my name's Ian. Welcome to my channel. This series is about role-playing games that have shaped our hobby and continue to do so. With so many games on the market and so many older games and editions available on PDF and print on demand from DriveThruRPG and elsewhere, the hobby can be a confusing place for new and even some veteran players. Here, I'm attempting to dispel some of that confusion by running through the history of different games, giving an overview of play features, sharing my thoughts, and outlining the essentials to pick up if you want to give it a go. Today, it's the turn of a childhood holiday staple of mine. When my sister and I were kids, our parents let us choose 2 or 3 new books to take on a summer holiday. Through this process, I gathered all sorts of books, from the novelisation of the old British children's TV show Rent-A-Ghost, big fan back in the day, to animal-related books such as Tarka the Otter in the Yearling, and even some classics, such as Watership Down, Treasure Island and White Fang. Inserted into that were the early releases within the Fighting Fantasy series from Puffin Books, and it is to these that we turn our attention today. Solo pick-a-path gaming is not a new thing. The various books within this genre fall under the general banner of branching narrative literature. That is, novels where at certain points during the narrative, the reader is given options as to the direction they wish things to develop, with the limitations of what the author has written to accommodate such options, and possessing of multiple possible endings. These novels have been around since at least the 1930s. The work Consider the Consequences was published in 1930, for example, and is the earliest known within the genre. Over the years, the form has evolved and refined in several different directions. The game Tunnels and Trolls, published in 1975, is a role-playing game, after the form of Dungeons & Dragons, that placed a focus on solo adventure game books, using a relatively extensive set of role-playing rules. The Choose Your Own Adventure series ran for 184 books from 1979, published by Bantam Books. Chaosium's RuneQuest branched into solo adventuring with SoloQuest from 1981, and TSR entered the arena with the Endless Quest series from 1982. But here in England, and also in 1982, the juggernaut of fighting fantasy was also beginning. Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson, the British one, not the American one of Ogre and Steve Jackson Games fame, had previously met with Penguin Books, one of Britain's most famous publishers, about the potential for game books aimed at young people that might tap into the rising popularity of fantasy and science fiction gaming through Dungeons & Dragons, RuneQuest Traveller and so on. Those two were at the heart of this rise, as, if you hadn't recognised the names already, they were both the founders of Games Workshop, of eventual Warhammer fame. But not at this point. Warhammer was a few years away, which had by this time positioned itself as a major player in the retail and publication of role-playing games and associated works, not in the least through the magazine White Dwarf. As a result of this meeting, they submitted The Magic Quest to Penguin, which, after some to and froing and development, became the first in the fighting fantasy line. Published in 1982 through Penguin's children's imprint, Puffin, The Warlock of Firetop Mountain is still a celebrated work to this day. I myself have 2 copies, my original that was bought for the winter school break of 1982. Is kept only for posterity, as its destroyed condition renders it useless for anything but a testament to how much use and abuse it received, and its replacement for further use and abuse. As an aside, as part of the research for this video, I discovered that I share a birthday with the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. Anyway, the book proved to be successful, and so further volumes were commissioned. To maximise the effort, Livingstone and Jackson decided to write the next entries in the series on their own. Volumes 2 through to 5 arrived in 1983, The Citadel of Chaos by Jackson, The Forest of Doom by Livingstone, Starship Traveller, the first science fiction entry, and an obvious reference to the role-playing game Traveller that Games Workshop was printing a UK edition under licence by that time, by Jackson, and City of Thieves by Livingstone. Livingstone's Death Trap Dungeon and Island of the Lizard King were the first couple out in 1984, with the American Steve Jackson writing the 8th book, Scorpion Swamp, for that year too. just to confuse everyone by having both Steve Jacksons involved in the same series. Caverns of the Snow Witch by Livingstone was next, which had first appeared in abbreviated form in Warlock magazine, issue 2, a magazine that had been created to capitalise on the popularity of the fighting fantasy series, and where much of the foundational source material for the background setting of at least the fantasy-based books was originally published. Warlock ran for 13 issues in total, from 1984 to 1985. Rounding out 1984 was Jackson's House of Hell, another adventure abridged in Warlock, and the first of the novels not to be written by Ian Livingstone or someone called Steve Jackson, be they British or American, being Jamie Thompson and Mark Smith's Talisman of Death. The series had run for a total of 59 books from 1983 to 1995, plus spin-offs such as the 4 volumes of British Steve Jackson's Sorcery, each book of which could be played on its own or as part of the wider epic, and including a 5th non-adventure book of spells. It also spun off into a series of novels, 2-player variants, and other paraphernalia. However, in 1984, alongside all of the other work, Steve Jackson, British, extracted out the core system used for the fighting fantasy books into a basic introductory role-playing game. The system used by the fighting fantasy books was even simpler than Tunnels and Trolls, comprising a basic series of tests against which dice were rolled. Test skill for combat and general capability as an adventurer, test luck as an equivalent to saving throws, and so on. Really simple. Each game had a specific adventurer type, useful for the challenges the book put forward. More of a warrior type in Warlock of Firetop Mountain, for example, with something akin to a fighting wizard for Citadel of Chaos. Unlike Tunnels and Trolls and Solo Quest, you didn't create your adventurer using rules more or less isolated from the adventure, and there was no real expectation to be able to use the same adventurer across multiple books. In that regard, there wasn't much in the way of character development, other than finding items that would give you various boosts. The introductory RPG changed that a bit, but the exception there was for it to be used as an in to the RPG hobby, rather than as something to use with the fighting fantasy series. Alongside this, in 1985, monsters from the fighting fantasy series to date were collected into a single work, Out of the Pit, an equivalent to Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual, if you will. Titan, a book describing the fighting fantasy world, came out in 1986. In 1989, this introductory RPG was expanded by Mark Gascoigne and Pete Tamlin into Dungeoneer, the advanced fighting fantasy game. Instead of an introductory RPG, Dungeoneer was the first volume of a full-blown game. Both Out of the Pit and Titan were re-released to slot into this new game and the format in the same year, and the rules were further expanded with Black Sand in 1990, which provided more information on the City of Thieves that we first met in Volume 5 of the Fighting Fantasy series. The final book in this series, Alancia, adding more rules and detail to the continent of Alancia on Titan, the continent where most of the Fighting Fantasy series took place, arrived in 1994. As another aside, in the midst of all of this, in 1986, Corgi, an imprint of Transworld, which was originally the British arm of Bantam Books, reprinted many of the Tunnels and Trolls titles under license from Flying Buffalo in the UK, likely in reaction to the popularity of the fighting fantasy books that they were having. Up until that point, Tunnels and Trolls hadn't received much attention in the UK. Unlike D&D, RuneQuest, Call of Cthulhu and Traveller, it hadn't been printed under license for the UK market. Flying Buffalo had also considerably smaller level of visibility in the UK than the likes of TSR, GDW and Chaosium. Anyway, back to Fighting Fantasy. The last Puffin releases in the Fighting Fantasy line were books 57 to 59, Mage Hunter, Revenge of the Vampire and Curse of the Mummy, and the 4-book Adventures of Goldhawk series by Ian Livingstone, all of which came out in 1995. And that was the end of Penguin's foray into the fighting fantasy world. In 2002, Wizards Books, a children's imprint of Icon Books, gained the rights to publish the Fighting Fantasy series, which they did so across 2 series, 29 books in Series 1 from 2002 to 2007, and 16 books from Series 2 from 2009 to 2012. These were distinct series, not continuations of either the Puffin series or each other, which meant that, for example, Warlock of Firetop Mountain received 3 separate reprints over the course of the Wizards run, as book 1 of both the first and second series, and as a 25th anniversary edition in 2007. All 4 of the sorcery adventures were incorporated into Series 1, along with 3 new works. Series 2 also included 3 new volumes, but overlaps by a large extent with Series 1, and includes none of the sorcery volumes. In 2017, the series was then picked up by Scholastic, a US company that should be familiar to most people, if not by name, then the open book logo that can be found on many books, including the Horrible History series, a personal favourite. To date, Scholastic have published 21 fighting fantasy books, including 6 originals by Ian Livingstone, Steve Jackson, British actor and author Charlie Higson, and daughter of the irreplaceable Terry, Rhianna Pratchett. Book 21, Shadow of the Giants by Ian Livingstone, was the last to be released in 2022, and Book 22 is slated to be authored by Livingstone for release in 2024. Meanwhile, the Advanced Fighting Fantasy RPG, which, if you remember, comprised Dungeoneer, Black Sand, Out of the Pit, Titan and Delancia from back in 1989 through to 1994, was picked up by Arion Games. Graham Botley set about revising the game for a second edition, releasing it in 2011. This revision brings the rules in from Dungeoneer, Black Sand and Delancia together, with additions from Sorcery, with a revised edition of Out of the Pit, updated to fit the second edition rules, and a reiteration of Titan also released in that year. The whole 3-volume shebang can be purchased now as a combined deluxe edition, which is the version that you see here. Via Arion Games and the second edition of Advanced Fighting Fantasy, or AFF for short, further volumes have been added to expand the game, largely driven by Botley. In 2012, Crown of Kings and Hero's Companion and Black Sand. In 2013, the Sorcery Spellbook and Beyond the Pit, presenting more monsters. The Warlock of Firetop Mountain came out as an adventure module in 2014, and a science fiction variant, Stellar Adventures, was released in 2017. The Titan Herbal in 2017, the Caladarian Response in 2018, Demons of Doom, A Rough Guide to the Pit, Weapons and Armour Catalogue, Travels in Arion and Return to the Pit in 2019, Creatures of Mishna in 2020, Combat Companion in 2021, Citadel of Chaos, another adventure, in 2022, and Encyclopedia Arcana Volume 1 in 2022, which presumably means the second volume is in the works. The latest releases at this time of this video are the Atlantis Campaign and Heroes of Titan. While a niche game supported by a small company, it is being supported nonetheless. And if you like simple, adaptable systems that are easy to tinker about with and have fun, you could make a worse choice. I'm going to round off this section with a couple of additional asides. First one, the game Maelstrom has also been picked up by Arion Games and was, like Fighting Fantasy, published by Puffin Books back in the mid-1980s. The second aside is that a short-lived company named Mirador published a handful of conversions of Fighting Fantasy adventures into the D20, that is, Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition, form in 2003. Compared to contemporary D20 fare, there is little to write home about here. Personally, I don't find them particularly well written or well presented. However, for one-shot D20 nostalgia fests for those that remember the Fighting Fantasy books, they were, shall we say, okay. Each character is defined by 4 characteristics: skill, stamina, luck, and magic. To start character creation, each of these begins with a set value, 4, 8, 8, and 0 respectively. A player has then 8 points to spend on improving them, up to a maximum of 3 points on skill, 4 on stamina, but points spent on stamina add 2 each to that characteristic, 3 on luck and up to 7 on magic. Skill is a broad characteristic, generally defining how good the character is at doing what the character does. Stamina describes a character's fortitude and resistance to damage. Luck is just that, or heroes need a bit of it somewhere, and the magic characteristic describes the potency of the character's spellcasting, and can be switched for skill in certain circumstances. Race selection modifies characteristics. For example, humans gain +1 to luck, and elves gain +1 to magic, and provide a handful of special skills and talents. Special skills are areas of expertise grouped into combat, movement, stealth, magical, and knowledge. Each skill is rated from 1, being someone having some basic training in the skills area, to 4, representing a master in the field. These levels are directly added to roles or characteristics that involve the skill for success checking. For example, a character with a skill rating of 2 within the combat special skill of axes would add +2 to their roll when attacking with an axe. Most bonuses from special skills add to checks made using this skill characteristic. Magical ones apply to use of the magic characteristic, and knowledge special skills can either use skill or magic. Races are assigned set levels in a handful of special skills, and characters can be customised further by adding 3 special skills at level 2 and 6 special skills at level 1. Those levels can be added to racial special skills if desired. Talents are extraordinary abilities beyond the scope of special skills. These are things like dark seeing, the ability to see in the dark, as traditionally possessed by elves and dwarves in the annals of role-playing. Characters receive talents from their race and can also pick 1 further talent. A handful of remaining statistics are left to calculate after all of that. Characters with magic receive magic points to fuel their spells, equal to double the sum of their magic characteristic and the wizardry and minor magic special skills. They also gain a selection of spells based on magic, wizardry and minor magic. Combat equipment is received by characters with weapon and armour special skills, and all characters get a backpack, a lantern, a handful of gold and a magic potion. Characters with the priestly magic special skill also get a holy symbol, and those with wizardry or sorcery have a spellbook. And then, barring any further purchases the character that wants to make using his handful of gold, it's off to adventure. The core mechanic of the game is dead easy. To succeed, roll 2 6-sided dice against the relative characteristic. Equal to or lower, and you've succeeded. Special skills add their value to the characteristic target, making it higher and therefore easier to achieve. Other modifiers may apply for situational conditions. In many cases, a natural 2, double 1, or 12, a double 6, carry special effects, usually automatic success, regardless of the net target, or catastrophic failure, respectively. Opposed tests are handled somewhat differently. This is where one character or monster is pitting against another in some way. In this case, each side rolls 2d6, adds the relevant characteristic and special skill level, and compares results. The highest total wins the combat. Luck is tested in the same way as the normal characteristic roll, other than it is reduced by 1 every time it is used. Sooner or later, even heroes might run out of luck, although luck can be awarded by the referee, called a director in this game, and is usually replenished at the end of an adventure. Combat is performed in rounds, in which combatants roll 2d6, add their skill, and add any special skills and other modifiers that apply. Opponents compare these totals, with the highest total winning the round and potentially inflicting damage against the loser's stamina. The winner rolls 1d6 and compares this to the weapon's damage chart to determine the amount of damage that might be inflicted, and the loser rolls 1d6 and compares that with their armour's defence chart to determine how much of that damage has been blocked. Whatever is left is applied to the loser's stamina. At a stamina of 0, a combatant is unconscious, and at -4 they are dead. An unconscious character at stamina of 0 will lose 1 point of luck for every 6 rounds of combat, roughly equivalent to 1 minute, until treated for their wounds. If they reach luck 0, they die. A double 6 is a critical hit. an automatic hit that inflicts double damage. If both combatants roll a double 6, both hit and inflict double damage. Rolling a double 1 is a fumble and requires a further roll on a fumble table to determine the results. Luck can be used in combat if desired. If a character loses a round of combat, he can opt to test luck. If successful, the attacker treats their damage roll as a 1. If the character wins the round, he can opt to test luck, and if successful, they treat their own damage roll as a 7, which produces the maximum amount of damage possible for that weapon. To give you a frame of reference, a normal sword inflicts 2 points of damage on a damage roll of 1, 3 points on a roll of 3 to 5, 4 points on a 6, and 5 points on a 7. This against the defense values for a chain halberd of 0 on a roll of 1, 1 on a roll of 2, 2 on a roll of 3 2 to 6, and 3 on a roll of 7. Characters have additional combat options beyond that basic concept. Swashbuckling, multiple weapons, feints, and so on. The base system is so simple that adding complexities to it isn't so complicated after all. AFF's magic system is broadly broken up into 4 parts: minor magic, wizardry, sorcery, and priestly abilities. Each is covered by a magical special skill. Minor magic involves spells of low effect. The dry spell dries things out, mend fixes things, spark gives a target a minor electrical shock that otherwise does no damage, and so on. Minor magic doesn't cost magic points to cast, but does require a magic test, modified by the character's minor magic special skill. An optional spellcasting fumble table, called Oops, can be used for double 6s rolled when casting minor magic. Wizardry also requires such a test, modified this time by the character's wizardry special skill. In addition, wizardry spells are rated from 1 to 8, being both a measure of the spell's power and the number of magic points required to cast it. Casters regain all of their magic points each day. There is no requirement to prepare or memorise spells. If the caster knows it and has enough magic points left for the day, he can cast it. Sorcery feeds on a character's physicality to power it. It operates in similar ways to wizardry, except that spells deduct their cost from the character's stamina rather than magic points. Sorcerers are able to render themselves incapacitated by casting a spell that reduces their stamina to 0. Priestly abilities are gained via the priestly magic special skill, which directly translates to the character's devotion and the god the character worships. No skill roll is required, nor are points deducted for calling upon such powers. The power is called on, devotion determines its level of effect, and that's it. Powers can only be used once per day each, although a second use can be gained by sacrificing a point of luck. Monster statistics are minimal, in accordance with the simple nature of the game. Skill and stamina to determine attacks and damage capacity, and any special capabilities, and some descriptive entries to note how the creature generally reacts, its intelligence, where it usually lives, and so on. Out of the Pit, the game's equivalent to the Monster Manual, describes 250 monsters over 128 pages, inclusive of tables and index. Players of 1st edition and basic Dungeons & Dragons will be familiar with the level of detail provided. Characters are awarded experience points for completing adventures, which can be spent directly on improving characteristics, except luck, gaining special skills, talents, and magic. They can also be retained to be spent at a later point, potentially being saved up to buy higher levels in these areas. Improving a characteristic from 4 to 5, for example, costs 100 points, against a usual experience point award of 25 to 50 per an adventure. The game has no concept of class or level. Characters are free to develop their characters in any direction that they desire through the expenditure of experience points. Other than the terminology used, AFF makes use of cinematic terms to describe the referee as a director and encounters as scenes. But this terminology is downplayed in the 2nd edition, where more common RPG and life terms such as rounds, minutes and turns are used. The game has a similar feel to it as basic Dungeons & Dragons. It is more swords and sorcery than high fantasy and has an emphasis on action over detailed plotting. There are no levels to track, and players have much more freedom to develop their characters as a campaign progresses in different directions, so in many ways it is far more flexible than its more famous counterpart. It is also a really accessible and easy to use system to introduce players new to the RPG hobby, more so than even basic D&D itself, which is my usual go-to in this regard. The fighting fantasy books were a staple for me and many others back in the day, and continue to prove popular with the current Scholastic editions. The system is easy enough, such that no cross-referencing to additional rulebooks or rules sections is required when going through the paragraphs of an adventure, which gives it an advantage over, say, Tunnels and Trolls in the solo gamebook field, while at least presenting some kind of role-playing system experience, which elevates it above the endless quest books. Where a game such as Tunnels and Trolls, and for that matter RuneQuest within the scope of Solo Quest, has the advantage is that you can transfer characters from one book to another, which is not the expected way to play the core fighting fantasy solo gamebook mode. From a solo gamebook perspective, the fighting fantasy volumes, especially the first 5 or 6 books that were part of my teenage years, I believe form the pinnacle of this particular solo gaming branching narrative form. The advanced fighting fantasy role-playing system that has grown out of that, however, I feel is lacking crunch for it to be something that I would use on a regular ongoing campaign. As an introductory system, however, it is fantastic and can act as a starting point to introduce basic RPG concepts leading into virtually any game thereafter. If a player moves on to RuneQuest, Tunnels and Trolls, Dungeons & Dragons, or indeed any other role-playing system, they will find some level of familiarity there that was introduced to them through playing AFF. If you want to introduce newcomers to RPGs in a simple, fun, swords and sorcery style of play that will take you about 2 minutes to explain, and a further 2 minutes for everyone at the table to have created a character, you can't go far wrong with this venerable warhorse. The Advanced Fighting Fantasy 2nd Edition Core Rulebook from Arion Games is the only absolute essential. It only includes a handful of monsters, so you'll probably want to pick up Out of the Pit too. Everything else is a nicety. You don't have to use Titan, Fighting Fantasy's default game world, as a setting, so all of the books that describe the place aren't necessary to enjoy the game. The deluxe edition of AFF wraps the core rulebook, Out of the Pit, and Titan into a single 440-page volume. If you want to use Titan, or have an example of an AFF world to draw upon, then this is worth going for, as you'll save a reasonable chunk over buying those books separately. Arion have also published a free quick start version of AFF. Link in the description if you want a taster. And that's it really. Volumes such as the Sorcery Spellbook and the Combat Companion can add more options and crunch, but I feel more inclined to pick up a game that is crunchier in and of itself, rather than take a simple game like AFF and sprinkle crunch upon it. It somewhat defeats the object of having a simple system in the first place. For the nostalgia trip, the Warlock of Firetop Mountain adventure is worth picking up. It'll make for an evening's entertainment, either as an introduction or as an RPG that doesn't need much in the way of setup that you can use as a filler for those sessions where key players can't make it. A solid, simple rules system drawn from a solid concept in solo gamebook play. Advanced fighting fantasy may feel a bit old school to some, but that doesn't stop it from being a lot of fun.